Our first stop of this segment is by Victoria Chen, and the title of the talk is Tagalog Voice Revisited.
Thanks, Harrison. Okay, so today I'll be revisiting a few remaining questions in Tagalog syntax. The first question has to do with its case alignment as being ergative or accusative. The second question concerns whether its pivot marking is better analyzed as a topic marker or some kind of absolute case marking. And the third question concerns the nature of its four voice affixes, specifically whether they are case agreement morphology, which indicates the case status of the pivot phrase. So I'll be discussing some previously overlooked spine facts and propose an alternative to the previous account, which I would love your feedback. So I will be proposing that Tagalog might be best analyzed as an accusative language with prominent topic marking that overrides morphological case, and its four-way voice morphology being the spell out of four different bundles of abstract agree relations, which form the topic of a clause, and that it's being a pretty typical discourse configurational language that employs over agreement morphology for topics and the subject. Okay, so we'll just quickly review the core trait of this voice system. So I think this is something you're all very familiar with. So like many other Philippine type languages, Tagalog possesses this four-way voice morphology, which controls the distribution of a marker, which I refer to as the pivot here, whose presence indicate that a phrase is the sole phrase in the clause eligible for A-bar extraction, and this is known as the pivot-only extraction constraint. Okay, so the argument marking in 1 is here illustrated in 3. So as you can see here in active voice clauses, the pivot marks are focused on the external argument, whereas in the non-active voice clauses, it focuses on different types of internal arguments, including some kind of adjunct-like phrases in LVCV clauses. So a core question here is, what exactly are the pivot in LVCV clauses? Are they argument or adjunct? So if these are some kind of applied object, then we could conclude that pivot would be some kind of case marker such as absolutive. But if alternatively they remain as adjuncts in LVCV clauses, then we can conclude that pivot doesn't mark case, as it can focus on either core arguments in LV or in AV or PV clauses, or adjunct in LVCV clauses. So here I'll first quickly review several well-adopted approaches, which assume the first scenario. Okay, so the case agreement approach to Tagalog voice assumes that the locative and circumstantial voice morphology are the morphological reflex of two types of inherent case licensed by an apple head, which introduces a pivot phrase in the highest internal argument position. And the ergative approach assumes pretty similar the same thing with locative and circumstantial voice morphology, whereby they are the spell out of an high apple head that licenses the pivot in the highest internal argument position, whereby this pivot can further undergo object shift. Okay, so the sheer assumption of these two well-adopted approaches was that locative and circumstantial voice morphology is associated with the presence of an apple head that introduces the pivot in the highest internal argument position. So if this analysis is on the right track, we would expect the pivot in LVCV clauses should always be asymmetrically C-commanding the internal argument. And we'll be examining that prediction in drawing on some new binding data. Okay, so the first construction we'll be looking into is transitive with an adjunct-like pivot. So we have just concluded that if the pivot in LVCV clauses are always apply object, as assumed in the previous approaches, then a pivot should always asymmetrically C-command an internal argument, as you can see in 8a. But alternatively, if the pivot in LVCV clauses could remain as an adjunct adjoining to the verb phrase, then it's possible that the thing could bind into the pivot and this scenario, importantly, is impossible with 8a. So a look into the binding fact suggested that probably the second scenario is optimal. So, and this is thing in mind. So in both LV and CV constructions, it's possible for a quantifier embedded inside a non-pivot thing to bind into a pronoun embedded inside the pivot. And so this points to a scenario in 8b, whereby a thing and the pivot are under sisterhood in the same phase, which could probably mutually bind into each other. So the take-home message here is that the binding fact in this construction raise questions to the applicative approach to LV-CV pivot and suggest that it might be remaining as an adjunct adjoined to voice P. Okay, so moving on to productive causatives, and for the sake of convenience, I will be referring to the theme of the caused event in productive causative, the causin, following Baker's terminology. Okay, so as you can see here in productive causatives, the distribution of the pivot is also conditioned by voice morphology on the verb, just like in simple clauses. And specifically in circumstantial voice clauses, the pivot obligatorily falls on the causative, and the causee is obligatorily marked with the marker CM2, which is found also on the internal argument of simple transitives. And an example here is 11. So a question here is that if the applicative, the apply object approach is on the right track, we would assume this pivot should be an apply object that's base generated higher than the causee in the highest internal argument position. But a look in the binding fact suggests that this prediction isn't borne out. So as you can see in 11, regardless of voice alternation among AV, PV, or CV, we see that the causee can consistently bind into the causin, even when the letter is in pivot status. So this suggests that the structure of productive causative in Tagalog might have the structure here in 12, whereby the causee is consistently licensed as a normal external argument of the caused event. And it doesn't matter whether the causin is a pivot or not. And this analysis is supported by a few other independent evidence. So the first is that the causee does behave like a normal external argument. And this is seen in the fact that it is compatible with agent-oriented adverbs and the adverb of frequency, again, as seen in 13. So I made Sue clean herself again secretly. So in this circumstantial voice clause, this again and secretly can independently modify this causee, suggesting that it is an agentive external argument rather than some kind of phrase licensed by an applicative phrase. Okay, so a few important take-home messages here is that the binding fact we have seen contradict analyzing circumstantial voice affixes as in high apple head, as we see no clear evidence for an applied object being present in this construction. And this, at the same time, raised questions to analyzing CV morphology as some kind of case, reflecting some kind of case licensed by a high apple head, as for the same reason we don't see evidence for the presence of that kind of apple head here. And third, importantly, the fact that the binding relation is unchanged regardless of voice alternation suggests that the licensing and pivot marking doesn't respect locality. This cast stopped on analyzing it as absolute case. And finally, the fact that the case marker CM2 is available to the causee in this kind of productive causative provides some good evidence for analyzing it as structural accusative rather than lexical oblique case. As in that external argument position, there is no lexical oblique case licensor available, whereas the case pattern we're seeing here follows directly from an accusative analysis. Okay, so some take-home messages: we have seen evidence for pivot being probably not being a case marker, and also for CM2 as accusative case. So moving on to ditransitives, and as you can see here, similar to what we've seen in causatives, voice morphology on the verb still controls the distribution of the pivot. And importantly, it's worthwhile pointing out that pigeon voice is not an option for Tagalog ditransitive, and we will revisit this in section 5. Okay, so the fact that pivot falls on the recipient in LV, but on the theme in CV suggests that they each might be an applied object in that clause if the applicative analysis to LV-CV is on the right track. So a look into the binding effect in this kind of construction, however, raised stop to that approach. So as seen in 16, regardless of voice alternation, a recipient can consistently bind into the theme in Tagalog ditransitives. And this is seen in 16A to C. So for Joey gave Leah a picture of herself. So this recipient is consistently a possible binder of the picture and be reflexive here, suggesting that the structural relation among these two arguments is unchanged. And 17 shows that the reverse binding relation is also possible, whereby you could have a quantifier embedded inside a theme to bind into the pronoun and the recipient. So the take-home message we can see here is that Tagalog ditransitive might be prepositional datives, regardless of voice alternation. And here I'm adopting a certain approach to prepositional dative with the binding effect that's accountable with what we have seen. So, and importantly, the fact that voice alternation doesn't affect binding relation, but affect pivot placement, again, raise question to analyzing pivot as any kind of case marking, as the licensing of case marking should respect locality. Okay, so in conclusion, we have seen some evidence that pivot might not be a case marker given the non-locality in this licensing. And so following several previous approaches, I will be assuming that pivot marks topic in Tagalog and in some other fluent type languages. And this topic marking overrides morphological case, which is why we've seen it's available on both core argument or adjunct in LV-CV classes. And here I'll be quickly talking about some potential new evidence for this approach. So just like some other fluent type languages in Tagalog, a discourse topic must be pivot marked. So in a question answer sequence like in 35, if you ask where is Maria's spoon with a clear discourse topic, then all four possible, and it's not limited to 4, but all 4 possible answers given by my informant have the discourse topic placed in pivot status. And it doesn't matter which voice is used, as long as this pivot requirement is satisfied, the sentence is considered acceptable. So this suggests a tight relationship between pivot placement and topichood. Okay, so this analysis makes 2 testable predictions. The first is that Tagalog pivot phrases should behave like an A-bar element, namely topic. And second, if this analysis is correct, then we expect to see some kind of true subject marking, such as nominative in Tagalog. So the first prediction that pivot should behave like an A-bar element is borne out by a number of binding tests. But due to the time constraint, I will be skipping these data. But happy to return during the Q&A. Okay. So the second prediction is that we might be able to find some case marking that looks like subject marker in Tagalog. And I'm arguing that what is traditionally analyzed as inherent ergative case actually behaves typically as a nominative case, which is the CM1, which is you can say in this 19 table. So the first piece of evidence for this traditionally ergative marking as nominative comes from the fact that it is available to accusative subject as in 25B. So this sort of raised off to analyzing it as an inherent ergative case, which should be tied to external argument positions. Okay. The second and third pieces of evidence come from the fact that this marker is unique per clause and is always unavailable to any non-highest external argument. So as you can see here in the causative paradigm, so CM1 is consistently available only to the causer and not to the causee, although both both arguments are typical external argument, as we have seen in the previous discussion. And one example here is 26, as you can see here. For I made Joey clean Aya, it's only the causative and not the causee that can bear the CN1 marking. And this is kind of unexpected if CN1 marks inherent ergative case, as ergative marked causee has been attested in a wide range of ergative languages with ergative marking agents. So both of these point to the proposal that CN1 might be some kind of structural case available only to the highest DP in the class. So entering conclusion, we have seen some evidence that pivot behave like a topic marker, CN1 as nominative case and CN2 as accusative. So it's a good time to sort of revisit the general mapping between voice selection and pivot selection in Tagalog. So this table here illustrates which argument will be marked as the pivot under what voice and what construction. Okay, so this is a little bit complicated, but some key observations are first, voice selection in Tagalog is sensitive to the relative structural height of the pivot. Namely, the pivot in AV is higher than that in PV and then that in CV. And this is clearly seen in transitives and causatives. Second, the pivot in patient voice clauses must be the second highest DP in the clause, and there is no exceptions. This accounts for the fact that this follows from the fact that an accusatives can't be marked in PV, and also we can't have pivot, we can't have patient voice in prepositional dative, and we'll revisit this in a minute. And second, importantly, we have seen that a possible pivot in circumstantial voice could either be an argument that is structurally low or an adjunct. Okay. And finally, to place an internal argument that is not the highest DP below voice as the pivot, then the only possible voice option is circumstantial voice. And finally, we have seen in this previous discussion that voice selection in Tagalog is actually not conditioned by either the case or the thematic role of the pivot. So importantly, for productive causative, we have seen that although both the causee and the causant are typical candidate for accusative case recipient, but the only possible trigger of PV morphology is the causee and not causant. So this raises further question to the case agreement approach, which assumes PV is tied to simply just accusative case. But based on this fact from causative, it looks like it's not that simple. Okay, so the proposal here is that Tagalog's four-way voice morphology might be best analyzed as the spill out of different bundles of abstract group relations that probed the topic. So I'll be assuming that Tagalog is the typical nominative accusative language with subject agreement and object agreement, illustrated as a phi on T and another U phi on the matrix voice. So the proposal here is that whenever the goal of U top is simultaneously the goal of other probe, then these two agreed relations will be bundled in their morphological output. And I'll be quickly walking you through what happened in each voice. So I assume that active voice morphology is the spell out of the bundle of topic agreement plus subject agreement. And this accounts for the fact that possible pivot in AV includes external argument in an ergative or a transitive, but also internal argument in an accusative. And also that it's possible for the causative, but not the causee in causatives. And moving on to PV, the proposal here is that it's the bundle of topic agreement and object agreement triggered by a phi feature on the matrix voice. So this analysis follows consistently from the cross-linguistic observation that object agreement is unique per clause and sensitive to phase-like condition that it can't probe into a PV, and that it's always restricted to the highest DP below the matrix voice. Specifically in productive causative, object agreement can only target the causee and not the causant cross-linguistically. And this current proposal also offer a neat account for the fact that patient voice is not an option in prepositional datives, simply because both argument inside a prepositional dative, both the theme and the recipient are CJ'd inside a PP, which is consistent with the fact that object agreement can't probe into prepositional phrases. And moving on to locative voice, I assume it's the spell out of the bundle of topic agreement plus a specific type of inherent agree relationship between a locative selecting preposition and its complement. And if you'd like to hear more about the specific evidence for this, we can come back to this during the Q&A. So this account captured the fact that LV morphology can be seen either in symbol clauses that contain a locative phrase or in preposition datives. And finally, I assume that CV morphology is actually the spell out of topic agreement when the goal of UTOP is not under any other agreed relation with other probe. And this over an account for why possible trigger of circumstantial voice morphology include arguments that are structurally low or adjunct attached to verb phrase, which are not locative phrases. Okay, so under this current approach, we could think that Tagalog's voice morphology is a kind of topic agreement that inflects for its combination with other agreed relation. And this capture successfully the fact that the mapping between voice and pivot selection in Tagalog can't be simply conditioned by the case, the thematic status, or the structural relation, the structural position of the pivot phrase. Okay, so a quick conclusion. I propose that Tagalog might be best analyzed as an accusative language with prominent topic marking and overt topic agreement that bundles with other type of agreed relation in its morphological spell out. Thank you.
Thank you, Victoria. So now I'm going to open up the floor for questions. If you have a question, please indicate it in the chat, and I'll call on you. Yining has a question.
Hi.
Hi, thanks, Victoria. I have many questions, but I'll try to keep them short. One question is about, have you thought about possessor raising constructions that use locative voice? So for your, most of your locative voice constructions, you have a prepositional phrase where the locative voice pivot is introduced below the theme. But in possessor raising constructions, like I cut the child's hair, where the child is the locative voice pivot, there seems to be a possessor-possessee relationship, and that seems to be the opposite of what you're saying, with the theme being above the locative voice pivot. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about that. Thanks.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And to be honest, I haven't really looked into that kind of data. And I have also been looking into whether other flippant type languages also use LV for that kind of construction. And I think something we might want to figure out is whether the possessor raising is really an instance of raising or some kind of co-indexation between the possessor and the possessum. And that might be crucial for whether we can account for that under the current proposal. But yeah, the short answer is that I have to look into that. And thanks for pointing that out.
Thanks.
All right. We have another question from Dan Kaufman.
Hi,
Dan. You could unmute yourself.
Hi. I think Kenny was first, but all right. So my question is, I mean, I have a bit of question about the data, because you kind of bulldozed through, like, you know, like Kroger's the second chapter of his dissertation, I think, showed pretty clearly that ang wasn't really, it was more about definiteness than topichood. But anyway, I just had two quick questions. So with infinitives, Tagalog has an infinitive that looks like a reduced clause, and as do many other
You're
sensual.
talking about the recent perfective, right?
No, infinitives. So like
Okay.
an infinitive, many Philippine languages have infinitives where you can't get any aspect. You have a non-finite verb, but you have total freedom of voice. You know? But
Right.
according to, you know, in a system where this is actually agreement with something very high in the tree and aspect is quite low, you would expect the opposite, right? So how do you get freedom of voice in infinitives that look reduced if agreement is happening so high? That was the first question. The second one was, you mentioned that you don't get patient voice in unaccusatives. I don't know how important that is to the overall story, but there is a kind of unaccusative where you do get a patient voice, the malefactives, you know, when you have something like ginugutom, gutom is hunger, patient voice plus hunger is being affected by hunger, and there's no agent there. There can't be any agents in those kinds of malefactive unaccusatives. So I'll just leave it at those two.
Yeah. So are you talking about control infinitives? Yeah, so which type of infinitives was the type you're mentioning? So if it's control,
but yeah.
Yeah, so my understanding, I might be wrong, but my understanding was that control infinitives in Tagalog is pretty large in structure. So there's some evidence suggesting that it could be some kind of CP with some kind of deficiency in its internal structure, but it's pretty large. So and actually cross-linguistically, it's not really rare that you have a CP in control infinitive. So it's not too crazy that voice morphology is available inside that kind of infinitives. But that's a really good question. And you're totally right that, yeah, those kind of infinitive can have all possible voice alternations. Yeah. And that's not possible in Formosan, by the way. And we do have evidence that these infinitives in Formosan is structurally much smaller than those in Tagalog. Right. So I think we would, I need to look more into how exactly is the structure of Tagalog infinitives. Thank you. And your second question was about possible PV and accusatives, right? I think that's pretty much like an innovation in Tagalog, and it's not very productive, right? Because I think across Philippine type languages, that's really not the prototypical pattern. I am inclining to think it's a pretty recent innovation in Tagalog that you can have PV that kind of an accusative associated with effectiveness, like the pivot is some kind of experiencer, right? So I'm thinking it's a pretty special case. Yeah, that might be an exception or an innovation in syntax. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
All right, we have a question from Kenyon.
So I had a question about example 25A.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah.
So how do we know that this is an unergative verb? Verbs of directed motion are sort of famous for not being particularly good at being either unaccusative or unergative in a sort of clean way. So what are the diagnostics for unergative and unaccusative that we're using here other than the sort of intuitive notion?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, so unaccusativity is really an understudied topic in Western Austronesian, I think. But possible diagnostics are, for example, so this is not the best example, but there's some verbs that allow the cognate object in Tagalog that can serve as the diagnostics of unergativity. And also, I think morphologically, generally, the active voice form for unergatives are different from that for an accusative, although there are exceptions, but we do see a general distinction in these two types. And another diagnostics was that, yeah, I actually talk about this in my dissertation, but you ran out of my head for now. So there is a third diagnostic that can help clarify the anergative and accusative distinction. Yeah.
And the walk verb is clearly anergative given these diagnostics?
It's just the prototypical anergative verbs like sing, dance, dream. Yeah, that type of typical anergative verbs.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.